There are two things to consider when trying to promote consistency with habits. First, the characteristics of the individual's style of thinking need to be evaluated. Second, the ways in which they are persuaded to commit also need to be considered. For example, instead of saying, "I'm someone who's trying to stop smoking," you'd say, "I'm someone who values their health." The key to building lasting habits is focusing on creating a new identity first. Your current behaviors are simply a reflection of your current identity. What you do now is a mirror image of the type of person you believe that you are, either consciously or subconsciously. You can't rely on being motivated. You have to become the type of person you want to be. And that starts with proving your new identity to yourself. If you're looking to make a change, then I say stop worrying about results and start worrying about your identity. Become the type of person who can achieve the things you want to achieve. The point of values-based goals is to cause fulfilling change that's tied to long-lasting results. So the time investment is definitely worth it if you sincerely reflect on your values. Another reason why you should have goals tied to your identity is because of the self-reference effect. Individuals demonstrate better recall and retention for information that is personally relevant or related to their self-concept. Self-awareness has been found to influence these judgments, and mirrors have been used to increase self-awareness in studies of moral reasoning and choices. Seeing oneself in the mirror evokes two very different types of self-awareness. The "who am I" sort of feeling, called private self-awareness, involves being aware of your emotions, values, and personal sense of self. On the other hand, public self-awareness is being mindful of how others see you and your behavior. Looking at yourself in the mirror can increase awareness of your personal values. Mirrors also reflect and can even magnify the negative emotions evoked by imagining harm to others. Mirrors can also raise awareness of social pressure to act to minimize harm. A glance in the mirror may also automatically evoke the orientation of being watched and judged by others. Speaking of mirrors, how you look also plays a role in how you feel. This is because of embodied cognition. The idea that the body or the body's interactions with the environment constitute or contribute to cognition in ways that require a new framework for its investigation. Embodied cognition has been the subject of numerous articles in popular outlets. Moreover, there is not an area of cognitive science, perception, language, learning, memory, categorization, problem-solving, emotion, social cognition that has not received an embodied makeover. A related concept is enclothed cognition, which refers to how the symbolic meaning of clothing can influence our behavior. For example, one study found that women feel more powerful when wearing heeled rather than flat shoes, while another claimed that wearing a police uniform causes people to pay more attention to people of a low socioeconomic status. Clearly, even momentarily interacting with items or thinking about doing so creates a personal connection. A similar concept is color psychology, the study of how different colors affect human mood and behavior. It explores how colors can influence emotional responses, as well as how responses to color are affected by factors such as age and cultural background. Much of the evidence in this emerging area is anecdotal at best, but researchers and experts have made a few important discoveries and observations about the psychology of color and its effect on moods, feelings, and behaviors. Colors in the red area of the color spectrum are known as warm colors and include red, orange, and yellow. These warm colors evoke emotions ranging from feelings of warmth and comfort to feelings of anger and hostility. Colors on the blue side of the spectrum are known as cool colors and include blue, purple, and green. These colors are often described as calm, but can also call to mind feelings of sadness or indifference. The mood-altering effects of color may only be temporary. A blue room may initially cause feelings of calm, but the effect dissipates after a short period of time. A person might prefer brighter, more attention-getting colors when they are younger, but find themselves drawn to more traditional colors as they grow older. Now, I'd like to share my findings from 3 of Dr. Robert Cialdini's books. This man is my favorite psychologist, partly because he's known globally as the godfather of influence for his contributions to the field. His principles for persuasion can be divided into 3 categories: relationship building, unity, liking, and reciprocity, reducing uncertainty, authority and social proof, motivating action, consistency, and scarcity. Reciprocity refers to the act of exchanging things in a way that benefits both sides. Social proof is our tendency to do what others are doing, and scarcity is rarity. Besides that, unity can often be mistaken for liking. However, connecting with someone over shared surface-level similarities, movie genres, types of food, or a sports team is different from the belonging someone feels with people they share a personal or social identity with. According to Cialdini, unity makes the other principles work better. However, unity has the potential to backfire. Groupthink is the modification of the opinions of members of a group to align with what they believe is the group consensus. In group situations, the group often takes action that individuals would not perform outside the group setting because groups make more extreme decisions than individuals do. Moreover, groupthink can hinder opposing trains of thought. This elimination of diverse opinions contributes to faulty decision by the group. Groupthink occurs when overemphasized group harmony encourages conformity when the leader is unapproachable or the group is isolated from outside viewpoints. 2 similar phenomena are the Ash effect and group polarization. The first is when the majority opinion, regardless of its truthfulness, influences an individual's judgment. The second term refers to the strengthening of an original group attitude after the discussion of views within a group. Of course, interactions between people can be positive, with an example being social facilitation. It occurs when an individual performs better when an audience is watching than when the individual performs the behavior alone. This typically occurs when people are performing a task for which they are skilled. Of course, since it happens when the task is easy, difficulty may result in worse performance, that is social inhibition. Laziness is also a problem in groups whenever improper delegation or time management causes diffusion of responsibility, and this phenomenon is dubbed social loafing. Social loafing occurs when our individual performance cannot be evaluated separately from the group. Thus, group performance declines on easy tasks. There are 2 types of social facilitation: co-action effects and audience effects. The mere presence of others can enhance performance on simple or well-learned tasks, but may hinder performance on complex or unfamiliar tasks. Co-action effects emphasize how parallel activity rather than direct competition or cooperation can impact individual behavior. Social facilitation occurs not only in the presence of a co-actor, but also in the presence of a passive spectator/audience. This is known as the audience effect. Certain portions were inspired by Cialdini's The Small Big, small changes that spark big influence, which more so complements than adds to his previous work. Clearly, social influence can be powerful for the right reasons or the wrong ones. Desirability or relevance can be used to encourage others to engage in uncommon beneficial behaviors, especially at the start of an interaction. For example, begin by appealing to potential instead of the reality of a situation. Similarly, statistics should be used to convey how common a certain behavior is or how its frequency is increasing, especially if the group you're talking about is similar to your target. To encourage helpful attitudes, it's important that people see progress being made, not just the end result. Conversely, you should focus on undesirability instead of prevalence when telling people not to do things, especially if they're deviating from a common behavior. Even if desirable behavior has been achieved, those involved may worsen their behavior for the sake of more closely resembling the norm. Rewards, of course, help to counteract this, although you likely didn't know that the reward could be as small as a smiley face next to written proof of good behavior. Despite this, frowny faces aren't as effective in punishing bad behavior. There are a few lesser-known factors to consider when managing undesirable behaviors. The desire to suppress thoughts constitutes a basic need long recognized in the psychological literature, yet individuals sometimes fail at suppression, ending up thinking the very thought they had intended to eschew. In groundbreaking work, Wegener and colleagues demonstrated that asking research participants to try not to think of a white bear resulted in subsequent rebound of such thoughts. Since the publication of the original white bear study, additional accounts have been offered for the post-suppression rebound effect. On the one hand, when asked to suppress a thought, an individual's conscious attempts not to think of the forbidden stimulus should promote success at the task. On the other hand, instructions that enjoin someone from thinking a particular thought are likely to create strong motivational pressures to do just that. That is, conjure up the prohibited thought. Such pressures stem from the well-documented phenomenon of psychological reactance, in which an individual is motivated to restore freedom in the face of a barrier or prohibition, resulting in increased desire for a forbidden stimulus. Theoretically, reactance can be aroused either by attempting to persuade an individual to engage in a certain action. For example, you must eat this cookie, or not to engage in one. You must not eat this cookie. However, according to the principle of negative potency, the magnitude of reactance pressures is predicted to be especially strong when an individual is explicitly encouraged to refrain from rather than engage in a particular response, precisely the conditions that have been found most likely to result in failure during thought suppression tasks. According to the attentional myopia model, in environments featuring competing behavioral pressures, such as the desire to eat high-caloric food versus the desire to adhere to one's restrictive diet, limitations placed on attention render it difficult to heed whichever pressure happens to be less salient. In situations involving strong eating cues, limits placed on attentional capacity, such as through the imposition of cognitive load, can make it difficult to attend to relatively weaker diet cues, resulting in increased consumption. Besides that, remember how what's presented to people first changes the way that they interpret what comes next. For example, if something is expensive, then a joke about it costing much more will make the actual price seem less bad. In fact, simply putting a big number in the name of something boosts people's willingness to pay more. Similarly, athletes wearing bigger numbers will be perceived as being more likely to perform well. Drawing long lines will increase one's guess of something's length, and listening to French music makes one more likely to buy a French item. But what about changing how others see the offerer? Well, they could prove that they're trustworthy by asking to step out for a moment to get something and returning with that object after a reasonable amount of time. Bonus points if the people involved have to help the offerer a little. Also, note that it's possible to make people feel certain way just by suggesting certain things to them, which can be seen in a phenomenon known as medical student syndrome, in which 70% to 80% of med students succumb to the symptoms of the disease they're studying. This happens because people begin to focus on the body part in question, resulting in a heightened sensitivity for that area. Considering the power that mental imagery has, one should use visuals that support their stance whenever possible. When you think about the words or imagery you use in reference to your goals, what associations come to mind? Unless the situation calls for a different tone, you should avoid being negative. The associations we have with words, images, metaphors, actions, and even the properties of our environment and items in our possession can influence our behavior and beliefs. This means that violent language impacts how aggressive one feels, and people are more cooperative on sunny days. On the topic of language, rhymes boost persuasion due to their aesthetic value and how easy they are to remember, thus an association with ease. Similarly, names or descriptions that are difficult to read are seen as less appealing, so bear in mind the importance of simplicity. Also remember that we're more likely to rely on simplicity when we're fatigued, rushed, overloaded, preoccupied, indifferent, stressed, distracted, or a conspiracy theorist. Simplicity comes with the benefits of not overwhelming others, not contradicting itself, and not being obvious in its intent. Consider the rule of 3 and only use 3 attempts at most. Considering the power that rhyming has, it may help you to come up with an affirmation that rhymes. Although I wasn't satisfied with the search results, I did find one worth sharing. In the words of Osho, an Indian philosopher, your mind is a garden, Your thoughts are the seeds. You can grow flowers or you can grow weeds. I came across that quote on a therapist's website, which also mentioned how you need to gain awareness of your feelings and accept them without judging them as good or bad. Being tired, sleepy, or fatigued, or distracted even momentarily makes you more easily persuaded. Considering the power that distraction has, you should use it to your advantage and state persuasive assertions after someone has been distracted. Despite what you may suspect, caffeine also makes you more easily persuaded, although weak arguments will still seem weak. However, simple messages are more effective when people have alcohol in their system. Returning to the power of association, note that it reflects how placebos still work. Even if one knows they're taking a placebo, people associate the ritual of taking medicine as a positive healing effect. Even if they know it's not medicine, the action itself can stimulate the brain into thinking the body is being healed. Similarly, everyone knows the sexual appeal sells, but even small things like being asked where Valentine Street is will make someone feel more romantic, thus boosting male bravado. Sexual stimuli can't be exploited though, as relevance is important when it comes to promoting a product. Using physically attractive people may not work either, since that tactic works best on single individuals. People in relationships gaze at average-looking people for the same amount of time. In fact, the best indicator of how imminent a breakup is how aware and attentive one's partner is of the attractive people around them. Besides that, note that the frightening consequences of poor health habits are more influential than milder, positive messages about good habits. After all, one is better at grabbing your attention, especially if it employs intimidating imagery. However, it's also important to give steps to fixing the problem, as otherwise people will likely justify their actions. Also, keep in mind that wary people are best comforted by popular options, whilst amorous individuals are better influenced by the need to stand out. Distinctiveness is so powerful at times that even the presence of competitors can make a product with a unique feature seem more appealing because it's different. While wording may seem minor, remember that you can accidentally create friction for your good habits. This is because of priming, a technique in which the introduction of one stimulus influences how people respond to a subsequent stimulus. Priming works by activating an association or representation in memory just before another stimulus or task is introduced. This phenomenon occurs without our conscious awareness, yet it can have a major impact on numerous aspects of our everyday lives. It not only influences our behavior, but how we feel about ourselves and others. One way to make use of priming is to reflect on your goals and sources of inspiration, both of which can be done through journaling. Other activities include music, exercise, and meditation. Maximize your chances of success by optimizing the way you frame your goal. On that note, the framing effect is when our decisions are influenced by the way information is presented. Equivalent information can be more or less attractive depending on what features are highlighted. This occurs because our minds like to take shortcuts called heuristics. An example of one is the availability heuristic, which is our tendency to use information that comes to mind quickly and easily. Older adults are more likely to experience things like this, especially if they're experiencing cognitive decline. All of this goes to show the importance of thoughtful research and resisting the influence our emotions have if not carefully taking advantage of them. Rhetoric, the art of persuasive writing, is traditionally directed toward other people, but there's no reason to think it couldn't be used on yourself. Using rhetoric, writers appeal to readers in three core areas: ethos, ethics, trust, logos, logic, reason, and pathos, emotions. This is often called the rhetorical triangle, and the triangle is strongest when each side is as strong as the others. One way to achieve ethos is to establish credibility by citing sources and using credible sources. As for pathos, that can be incorporated by appealing to a wide range of emotions, including excitement, anger, or disappointment. For example, you could use curse words to better convey how passionate you are. After all, seeing as attention-grabbing things are more memorable, it'll be easier to care. Finally, logos is achieved by including data and stats and avoiding fallacies. Know that fallacies are mistaken beliefs used to improperly justify arguments. it makes sense to come up with and debunk counter-arguments so that you can't use those as excuses later. If you're worried that you'll accidentally convince yourself not to pursue your goal, recognize how this isn't necessarily bad. After all, goal setting should ideally have a deliberation process in which you compare and contrast multiple perspectives before arriving at a conclusion. Another reason why you should learn about opposing viewpoints is because persuasion, a revolutionary way to influence and persuade, encourages the reader to. It states that rebuttals are typically more powerful than arguments, so finding ways to weaken the strongest counters will help you accept the original message. Yes, 50 Secrets from the Science of Persuasion also delves into the benefits of trustworthiness, which is connected to likability. One recommendation is to be able to state one of the minor weaknesses before talking about a strength. This is especially effective when the flaw relates to the strength. Being transparent is especially good when you have control over the issue. However, there's nothing wrong with blaming an issue on something external when that's the truth. On the topic of comparing and contrasting, the decoy effect describes how, when we are choosing between two alternatives, the addition of a third, less attractive option, the decoy, can influence our perception of the original two choices. Decoys are asymmetrically dominated. They are completely inferior to one option, the target, but only partially inferior to the other, the competitor. Similarly, items or people placed in the center are thought to be the most popular or influential. Besides this, you can also make use of the emotional side of persuasion, ethos, through the humor effect. It's based on the idea that amusement or laughter creates a more enjoyable learning experience, leading to improved memory retention. Of course, this can backfire if you don't use humor appropriately and end up distracting yourself. Personal preference plays a role too. Still, anything you can do to make your information stand out more will make it more memorable. Inspirational quotes typically aren't funny or silly, but if you're interested in finding one that is, go for it. An example of one I found is, even if you're on the right track, you will get run over if you just sit there. Those are the words of Will Rogers, who was not only an author, but also an actor on Broadway and Hollywood. The website I got that quote from also shared a therapist's advice. Motivation isn't tied to our feelings as much as it's tied to our thoughts, meaning we can motivate ourselves by adjusting our mindset. Moving on, persuasion, a revolutionary way to influence and persuade, delves into the importance of if-then plans. These are more properly known as implementation intentions, which register certain cues and settings where we can further our goals. They allow us to take appropriate action when presented with the cues. The wording can also put us on high alert, which simply asserting one's intention doesn't do. On the topic of being specific, influence, Science and Practice, 4th edition, mentions that saying because makes your message more persuasive, even if you don't have a good reason. This is because of the association that people have with the word. When possible, use the labeling technique. This entails assigning a trait, attitude, belief, or similar to someone, then requesting that person to do something that reflects that label. While it's important to be able to question aspects of your identity, reminding yourself of positive, consistent traits is useful. Besides this, we can be asked to predict if we'll do something to increase the likelihood of us doing so, especially if the behavior is a socially desirable thing, since we want to follow through on such promises. This connects to the concept of commitment contracts, and this persuasive technique is strengthened when the person provides the reasoning behind their decision. As for how you can increase the likelihood of following through on your promises, you should actively make your commitments, such as by writing them down. Even then, simply checking a box has been shown to work. In total, commitments are ideally simple, specific, made publicly, action-oriented in a way that respects freedom of choice while still providing structure, and tied to cues in the environment. Regarding attempts to persuade older individuals, bear in mind that as people get older, the desire not to be inconsistent is stronger. To counteract this, don't criticize to prevent defensiveness, but consider praising their older beliefs/previous actions. Then state how the new beliefs associated with what you want them to do connect with their older ones. If you're unable to complement their traditional beliefs/deeds, you can say that they were correct at the time or right based on what they knew. Although you may not be old, you may have been holding onto aspects of your identity that you'd like to let go of. Remember to be patient with yourself, even if you relapse. Off days are part of the process, and at most, are just signs to change your strategy. Building on social labeling theory, we examined the possibility of nudging individuals' creativity using creative and not creative labels. Study 1 showed that subjects labeled as creative or not creative perform better in a creative task than unlabeled subjects and established the moderating effect of self-perceived creativity. Among subjects scoring low on self-perceived creativity, those labeled as creative perform better than those labeled as not creative. Conversely, among subjects scoring high on self-perceived creativity, those labeled as not creative tend to perform better than those labeled as creative. Confirmation bias, simply put, is a preference for seeking or attending to information that is consistent with currently held beliefs or hypotheses. Confirmation bias is related to what's called a positive test strategy, a cognitive tool or heuristic that can be very useful. The important thing to recognize is that there is nothing inherently wrong with positive testing. In many contexts, it works. This point was inspired by persuasion, a revolutionary way to influence and persuade, which mentions that positive test strategy can be used to encourage certain behaviors. You can make someone focus on a characteristic of theirs by making them think of something related to that trait before saying or asking if they have it. They don't even need to have that characteristic to any significant extent, meaning this technique can be used when you don't know the person well. As for using it on yourself, confirmation bias is tricky since it's strengthened by thinking about the past, which is often unproductive. Even so, because positive test strategy is easy, using affirmations before starting a task will help. It's more effective to give people only a couple of options rather than a lot when you want to get the attention of others, since more choices mean that making a decision will be more difficult. This is the paradox of choice, and it goes to show that you shouldn't overcomplicate your goals. Similarly, when you wish to get reasoning from others, asking them to say less will result in a higher evaluation of the thing than asking them to say more. You could also utilize this aspect of psychology to make someone view something more negatively by getting them to provide needless amounts of explanation for why they like something. Part of the reason why this happens is that things that are easy to imagine are more desirable. Keep this in mind when you want yourself or others to do something unusual. Additionally, we feel more positive toward things that are easily read and pronounced and believe that statements with rhymes are more accurate than those that don't. This is due to how our minds process rhymes, a psychological phenomenon called the rhyme as reason effect. Besides this, people are more likely to make more decisions in favor of something when they believe they're getting closer to completing a goal. An example of this in effect is giving customers loyalty cards that already have a stamp on them. Loyalty cards work because of the goal gradient effect, in which individuals tend to increase their effort and motivation to achieve a goal as they get closer to its completion. Regarding the paradox of choice, there's a similar psychological effect known as imposter syndrome, which causes self-doubt and perfectionism. It also causes analysis paralysis, the feeling of being unable to make a decision due to overthinking a problem. Of course, this is the same thing as the paradox of choice, just with an emphasis on problem solving. It matters because it causes decreased performance and creativity. Luckily, it can be counteracted by giving yourself a deadline and clarifying the intended outcome as much as you can to narrow down choices. However, consider prioritizing action over research. Yes, this is ironic considering the nature of this video, which is made easier by using a decision-making framework. After all, following a method aids in self-awareness. This prevents things like bounded rationality, which causes us to seek satisfying outcomes instead of optimal ones. Of course, this can be good if it counteracts perfectionism, and the positive form of this concept is known as satisficing. Maximizing, which is striving to make the best decision, is associated with better outcomes but also lower levels of happiness, regret, and self-esteem due to the fear of missing out. Overthinking is bad, and decision-making frameworks are meant to prevent that, but striving for satisfaction may make us succumb to the commitment bias that causes us to hold onto past behaviors despite how flawed they may be. Another reason to follow a method is to make things easier on yourself and thus counteract decision fatigue. Our ability to make decisions deteriorates when our cognitive abilities are depleted, which ties into the importance of routines, eating enough throughout the day while also eating healthily and taking breaks. There's another negative psychological phenomenon worth exploring. Loss aversion is the notion that people hate losses more than they enjoy gains. Studies show that people are more likely to lie and cheat to avoid losing something they already have than to acquire it in the first place. For example, say a person makes an innocent mistake. Then, to avoid injury to her reputation, she may intentionally lie to cover it up. One way to take advantage of loss aversion is to place desirable outcomes in distinct categories to create a need for completion, even if said groups are meaningless. Influence, Science and Practice, 4th edition, delves into this concept, which reflects how knowledge doesn't always encourage change, unless, of course, the info is presented in a way that causes a realization. Thus, you should be wary of the potential loss aversion has to decrease your motivation, while also trying to frame things in a way that takes advantage of it. For example, make deadlines as close to the present as you reasonably can to avoid procrastination. In situations where waiting is needed, using basic activities as distractions helps with patience. The foot in the door technique is a compliance tactic that assumes agreeing to a small request increases the likelihood of agreeing to a second, larger request. The door in the face technique is a compliance method whereby the persuader attempts to convince the respondent to comply by making a large request that the respondent will most likely turn down. These strategies reflect the human need for consistency. Influence, Science and Practice, 4th edition, recommends using reasons instead of threats for encouragement, avoiding large rewards so that your justification isn't mainly derived from external factors, and writing down what you want to do so that there's a visual reminder showcasing how you feel. This reminder can be phrased as a question so that it's less likely to encourage resistance. Another way that our need for consistency manifests is the mere exposure effect. That's our tendency to like things more after we've repeatedly noticed them. This also means we are more likely to adopt ideas that we are repeatedly exposed to, especially by the media. The illusory truth effect suggests that the more we hear something, the more likely we are to believe it's true. Although you can take advantage of this, there is a risk in believing something simply because you're used to hearing it. Fortunately, the mere exposure effect may counteract itself. Research has shown that too much repeated exposure eventually lessens our attraction to a stimulus as it loses novelty. We can actually start to avoid something if we are exposed too much to it. Yes, 50 Secrets from the Science of Persuasion uses the term attitudes follow behavior principle in reference to the following phenomenon. Sometimes as we move through our lives, we will realize that some behaviors we are engaging in do not fit with one of our attitudes, or we will have two attitudes that we realize seem to contradict each other. This inconsistency or conflict results in an unpleasant feeling that we want to immediately get rid of or reduce, called cognitive dissonance. It is another instance of how a behavior impacts our attitudes and, in this case, could change it. Relatedly, choice supportive bias may occur, which causes individuals to recall their choices as better than they actually were. This phenomenon often occurs retrospectively when individuals attribute more positive features and fewer negative ones to the options they chose in the past compared to those they rejected.
While cognitive dissonance can cause effort justification that hinders our goal setting and growth, it can be used to our benefit, such as through the saying is believing effect, which refers to the process of believing the things one has said, especially if one was speaking to others. This is related to how useful affirmations can be. There's also the induced hypocrisy paradigm, which showcases that the desire we have to avoid being hypocritical can encourage us to shift away from detrimental beliefs and toward our aspirations. Of course, individual differences and preference for consistency influence how susceptible one is. But this also means that caring too much about consistency makes one vulnerable to the induced compliance paradigm, in which people change their beliefs after someone compels them to do something that contradicts their current stance, i.e. counter-attitudinal behavior. Integrity and critical thinking are valuable tools.
Finally, I'd like to end with some neat facts from Yes, 50 Secrets from the Science of Persuasion. People generally aren't good at identifying what affects their behavior. Therefore, it's easier to get others to do what you want than you might think. In fact, merely changing how something is worded can have a considerable effect. Although this requires more than a change in wording, note that fear can be used to persuade people if they're also told about a specific way to reduce the danger. Otherwise, they may succumb to denial. Similarly, don't just notify beginners of mistakes to avoid, but what should be done instead. Moving on, after someone looks in a mirror or is otherwise reminded of who they are, they're more likely to behave in a socially desirable way, as long as it's in accordance with their values. In fact, mirrors can be more effective than video surveillance, since that makes employees feel like they aren't trusted. As for things that have a similar effect to mirrors, examples are being asked your name, wearing a name tag, and seeing pictures of eyes on a wall.